Hi, this is Scott Grant. You're listening to The Scott Grant Show on 103.9 FM WSOS out of St. Augustine. And we're recording today from beautiful downtown Ponte Vedra Beach. My guest is Jeremiah Blocker, and we are thrilled to have you. Hi, Jeremiah.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I appreciate it.
And I imagine you go a lot of places, people want to interview you, they want to talk about county politics and issues and stuff like that. You may be pleased. We're planning on not doing that today. We're going to talk to you about history, which is something I think you and I both love.
Absolutely. I love history. History is an important subject to me. I think it's one of those things that you have to understand the past to really be able to navigate the future. So I'm very excited.
And before we went on the air, we're talking about giving presentations, and you've heard my presentation about the Gulf of America, which is what we're going to talk about today. And you like that presentation? I
love that presentation. I thought what really was important when I heard it over at Palm Valley, at the Palm Valley Community Association.
Oh, yeah, I remember you coming to that one. I was actually really excited that you were there. I was pointing you out to my family. I go, that's Jeremiah Blocker over there. He's come to hear me speak.
Well, I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. Being a young student at the University of Florida, Father Michael Gannon, who retired from the priesthood, he obviously wrote Operation Drumbeat. My father and mother actually were friends with Father Gannon. So growing up in Ocala, I got a couple of opportunities growing up to spend time with him, to learn a lot about Operation Drumbeat, and just what an incredible story of courage and combat. So.
Well, that's pretty interesting. And he was a professor of yours at Florida. Is that right? University of Florida?
So he was. So I actually never had Dr. Gannon as a professor, but he was in the history department there. I majored in history at the University of Florida. But he, at that point, when I was there, and this would have been 2000, 2003, he was really had retired for the most part. He was kind of there more in a research capacity. He would still give speeches and talks, and all of us as students, just the opportunity to learn from him was incredible. His book on the history of Florida was really, I think, still a seminal classic on, if you want to understand Florida history. I think pretty much any course in Florida history, his book's a requirement. But then going beyond that, just his research and Florida's involvement during World War II with Operation Drumbeat is incredible.
The history of Florida, and particularly I think the early history of Florida, he's well known for, and you said seminal. I think that's a great word. He's his books are the seminal books on that topic. He stepped outside when he did Drumbeat, and I think he had always been intrigued by that submarine attack that occurs here in April of 1942. When he's, I think, 16 when that attack occurs, and he says he goes out to St. Augustine Beach and he can see the flames in the distance. And then for the next, 35, 40 years, he wonders. And nobody knows. That's part of the story, is that for a long time, nobody knows which submarine it was, because all that stuff was censored, and of course we didn't really know which German submarines were here. But he was driven by that. Now, I never met him, but tell us, what was he? You've met him. What was he like?
He was an incredible gentleman. He was very humble. He was struck me as someone that was on a quest. He had some experiences as a young man, as a young adolescent, that had left him with a deep impression. He was a very spiritual man. He was a Jesuit priest for a number of years. Then left the priesthood and was married, but very religious. He came across that way. He was very very interested in how the church has shaped the history of Florida, the missions. I remember several of his talks at the University of Florida focused really on the mission system, how that brought enlightenment to Florida at the time. Different historians view that differently. We're in a different time now, but he really emphasized, the kind of the culture. Also, from the equality standpoint, how he wrote about this in several of his books and highlighted it in several talks as when I was a student, highlighted the issues of really in Florida under the Spanish, African American communities flourished, and you had Fort Mose, and you had the kind of free African American movement here, and how really that was based on how the Spanish approached that, how they were a little bit more enlightened, and a lot of that was based on.
Well, they're different. Part of the story is that each of the European countries that come here to colonize do so in a different way. We're out of time for this segment. We're going to go play a couple songs, and we will be back with County Commissioner Jeremiah Blocker. Hi, this is Scott Grant. You're listening to Scott Grant Show, and I'm here with Jeremiah Blocker. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
this is a real thrill for us, and I think for the audience as well. Before the break, we kind of were talking about Michael Gannon and his histories that he wrote, including Operation Drumbeat, which is, of course, about the Nazi U-boat attacks off the East Coast in the United States, particularly in early 1942. And one of the things, I do this presentation, you've heard it, one of the things I always like to point out is that the Germans, during the first 7 months of 1942, sank 244 ships off the East Coast of the United States, which is more than one a day.
Absolutely.
And I don't think most people know that. Would you agree?
Well, absolutely. I think one of the things that's really, been hidden from the public is the peril that we were in at that time. And there was a reason for that. There was a national security risk where really our government did not want the public to understand how vulnerable we were. My father was born in 1937. He remembered 43 and 44, some of these attacks. And, as a young man, as a young boy, and the population was in great fear because they knew something was happening. But yeah, no, just the history behind that is incredible.
Yeah, and the government did want to keep it quiet, and that's one of the things that Gannon complains about. But you talked about it, we couldn't keep it quiet. And obviously when you had events occurring close to shore, and as it turns out, the closest attack to shore occurs right here in Jacksonville Beach, and that is on April 10th, 1942. The German submarine attacks the oil tanker SS Gulf America about 4 miles off the coast. And it's funny, in doing these presentations and talking to other people who study the topic, there's a lot of discussion about how far. But the wreck's about 4 miles off the coast right now. And so I think that that's about the right number, which is not a lot. People stood on the shore and watched the torpedo explode and watched the gun battle that followed. Can you imagine that?
Well, no, and when you think about it, it's war brought right to your doorstep. These were, moms, taking their children out for an evening stroll and watching, something that was very terrifying happen in front of them. The war at that point was very distant, across the continent or in the Pacific, and to have it right on your doorstep right here in St. Johns County was, I imagine, very frightening.
Yeah, I think people were terrified, and in fact, the saboteurs come 2 months later, and that just adds to the paranoia. But there was a fair amount of paranoia, and there was some sense that someone was telling the Germans where the ships were, and not just here in Florida, but all up and down the East Coast. And substantial efforts were made to root these spies out. It turns out there really weren't any spies. The Germans were just sitting off the coast. Our ships were cruising up and down with their lights on, and we didn't have any blackouts on shore. And that's part of the Jacksonville Beach story. The whole beach was lit up. Both Ferris wheels and the roller coaster were operating. And I always kind of imagine myself as maybe a 12-year-old atop that Ferris wheel when the explosion. Can you imagine? The thing would have shook like crazy.
Well, and just the munition explosions as well, just would have reverberated well into. I think Gannon referenced how there were reports, not verified, but well into the inland, there were people that heard the explosion. I mean, the word spread very quickly. My father and family grew up in Ocala. They heard about it very quickly. They actually drove to St. Augustine Beach the next day, saw some of the remains of the ship, which is still burning for some time. The other issue that with the saboteurs coming as well is we had a number of Waffen-SS prisoners here in Florida as well at Camp Landing. So the areas, some were Waffen-SS, some were the others. So you had the elite of the German, really Nazis that were prisoners here. My father met some of them.
That's interesting. I know some of them were down in Hastings.
Yes.
Probably farming potatoes, but working on farms. You mentioned something. I want to come back to it after the break. But right now we're gonna take a break. We're gonna play a couple songs, and we'll be back with Jeremiah Blocker on the Scott Grant Show. Hi, this is Scott Grant. You're listening to the Scott Grant Show, and I'm here with Jeremiah Blocker. And before the break, we were talking about the Gulf America and your parents going from Ocala. Did I say that right? Ocala or
yes? Yeah. So Ocala.
Ocala. I want to sound like a Southern.
There we go.
Ocala to St. Augustine Beach to see the wreck.
Right. Yeah. Just to clear, it was my father. He was born in 1937. He was much older than my mother, but my grandfather actually took them.
Okay, so it was your grandfather.
Yeah.
One of the things that fascinated me, and I started out on this project of telling this story about 2.5 years ago, and I along the way expected to find more information, which I did. One of the things I expected to find was a picture, which I didn't. Nobody ever came forward and even hinted that they had a picture. And you're actually the first person to ever say to me they went the next day. And I've always envisioned it this way, that the attack occurs around 9:30, so it's 10 hours later at dawn. There must have been a lot of smoke. I mean, 90,000 barrels of kerosene are on fire. Now, they would have burned out, but they must have left a lot of smoke. And there's no picture of the smoke. Did your grandfather ever say, what did he tell you about going to see the wreck?
So my father told me essentially that they had heard for some time that there were rumors of, he was a little boy at the time, 6 or 7, that there had been motels and hotels in Miami that had been shelled by the Germans. Those rumors had spread. They ended up not being true, as we know. That never quite happened. There were also rumors that they had come ashore prior to the saboteurs. There had been rumors about Germans coming ashore. I think this fed into this idea that people felt very vulnerable and were aware that something was going on. But after the sinking of the Gulf of America, basically they drove over in the afternoon because they wanted to see for themselves what had happened. And there was a lot of concern whether it hit a mine. As a boy, he was absorbing this and listening to his parents talk. And he said it was incredible. It was just very vivid as a child seeing it on the beach. It was still burning. And I think at that point they were still assessing where the survivors were. That was his recollection. But I think it really, in his mind, crystallized and drove home the point of this is very real on our doorstep. This is not some distant war somewhere.
Yeah, and that's a common sentiment I hear people express. Both sentiments. One, that it was sort of an awe moment. It was overwhelming. Sort of the same thing people say about the Beatles, going to see the Beatles here in 1964, that it was just this, they were so overcome that they can't sometimes even remember what happened. And I think that was true with the submarine. The other thing with that submarine attack, at least initially, most of the people on the shore thought it was an accident, that they had collided with some other tanker or ship, or somebody had set the mess on fire, I guess. But they thought it was an accident. The idea that a submarine had come all the way to Florida and attacked a vessel right in sight of the coast was incomprehensible. And I think you're echoing that thought, right?
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of people felt, there was some sense of vulnerability because of what had happened with Pearl Harbor. But there was this idea that, we were going to bounce back and go after them. I think the Battle of Midway happened maybe about 6 months, 9 months after that. Well, shorter, 2 months. So this attack happened, kind of in that still framework where, we were revving up for combat, we were revving up for war. So I think it re-emphasized to be how vulnerable we truly were. Obviously there were not a lot of reports, because we try to keep some of that confidential. But it was out there in the open. People were aware something had happened. So.
Oh yeah, they're definitely trying to keep it covered up. They didn't want people to know, and of course people did know. I don't think anybody at that time knew the extent. No. I think had you told those people one ship more than every day, they would have been shocked. At the same time, as you kind of pointed out, the rumors were rampant. And you talk about the saboteurs coming here. One of the things is the saboteurs don't do anything. But on the other side, the saboteurs scare us so much that we devote thousands and thousands of man hours. And you've seen the picture of the Coast Guardman riding the white horse on St. Augustine Beach with the gun slung across.
Absolutely.
It's a cool picture.
It is.
You kind of want to be that guy.
It screams Wild West, but in a different era and different context. Also I think it highlighted just talking about the saboteurs coming. These were people that looked like us. They spoke fluent English.
Well, 2 of them were Americans.
Right.
2 of them were American citizens. Right. The others had all lived here. These segments go by fast with you. We're going to take another break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk some more history with County Commissioner Jeremiah Blocker. Hi, this is Scott Grant. I'm here with Jeremiah Blocker, and we've been talking history, and it's been fascinating.
It has been.
We really enjoyed having you, and I think the audience is going to like you as well.
Well, Scott, I appreciate being here. I think this is fascinating, talking about history. I mean, this it doesn't get any better than this, right? What do they say, that there's no fiction that's stranger than history?
So that's probably true, and I'm sure they do say that, but that's probably true. I mean, there's a lot of pretty bizarre stories in history, and it's funny, I wasn't going to do this, but because you said that, it jars the thought in my head. Part of this story is, as we were discussing, this idea that there was this massive campaign off of our coast, and 3,000 guys died. That's more than at Pearl Harbor. That's more than at 9/11. It takes 7 months, but that's still a fairly short period of time. and they're all killed by German submarines. And, as we said, nobody knew it. But they were concerned, the government was concerned, that people on shore were alerting the submarines about our shipping. And so one of the things the government does is they move Lucky Luciano, who's head of the New York Mafia, from Sing Sing down to Rikers, and they put him in a private cell, and they give him unlimited access to the public so that he will shut down those traders who are working on the docks. And so you say history is stranger than fiction. I mean, you couldn't make that up.
No, that's true, and it just illustrates the different points in our history. We've cut a deal with the devil, if you will, to accomplish our goals to protect the public. That's an example of that, where the mafia in the Northeast kind of protected the areas. At the same time, they were kind of war for our government. But a fascinating story.
Yeah, no, just it's interesting to me. And when I first heard it, I knew that Luciano had helped out in Sicily, in the invasion of Sicily. I think you probably did too. You probably learned that. I see you nodding your head. You did. But I didn't know that the partnership had begun earlier to try and stop the submarines from sinking our ships. Now, you and I actually have a fair amount of things in common, but one of them is we speak a lot, particularly to service clubs. How often do you speak? I mean, how often is this something you're called upon to do? I saw you this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably at least 2 or 3 times a week, I'm speaking to some group, and I think it's an opportunity to understand what people's concerns are. I try to come with a message, but also leave with a message and really get a feel for what the public's concerns are. Being in my position, that's important. I represent the people, and I want to understand what their concerns are. But I try to welcome these opportunities to engage with the public as much as I can.
No, I think it's great, and I love seeing you up there. I love the presentation you did to my Rotary Club, and then this morning when you gave out the award to the Recorder for their 50 years. And it's probably worth mentioning them at this point. I love the Recorder. You're a big fan?
Big fan. The Recorders have impacted us tremendously, right? And I don't think there's anyone in Ponte Vedra that hasn't had a positive experience with the Recorder. They do such a great job.
Yeah, and some of those local newspapers have done better than some of the sort of regional newspapers that have suffered because everybody can get their news on the internet. With the Recorder, it's sort of about us.
Right.
And there isn't a site so far on the internet, and I mean Facebook, but there isn't a site that sort of picks out the best of us.
Right.
And I think today was a celebration of the Recorder and the best of us.
Well, I agree, and really, it's almost like a community newspaper. It's like your neighborhood newspaper. You read about your neighbors, your friends, what's going on in your community, and it's important. And I think it helps build that sense of community that we really cherish here in Ponte Vedra.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Now, also, I had wanted to do some plugs for an Alzheimer's event that's coming up on the 16th. It's a walk, and it's for the Northeast Florida Alzheimer's Association. Now, the guy that mentioned this to me is a guy named Mitchell Hunt. Mitch is the president of Center State Bank and a friend of mine, and his dad had Alzheimer's, and my father suffered from Alzheimer's. I watched him decline out at World Golf Village over 5 years. Did anyone in your family suffer from Alzheimer's?
Yes, I have several of my extended family have been diagnosed and have passed away from it. They believe my grandmother had it. Unfortunately, she passed away. Fortunately, she passed away before they were able to make that diagnosis. But it's unfortunately a disease that's affecting too many of our population. When you look at the neurological diseases that really ravish, the public, whether it's Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, or ALS, really Alzheimer's is increasing at a rapid rate. Right now, the ratio is 1 in 20.
Oh my!
That's incredible when you think about it. Those are troubling statistics.
1 in 20. That's a big number. Well, what I want to do is remind the public that on the 16th, which I think is a week from Saturday, at Hemming Park, there's an 2-mile Alzheimer's walk where you can raise money to help cure Alzheimer's in our lifetime. And we'll be back after a couple songs with Jeremiah Blocker. Hi, this is Scott Grant, and I'm here with Jeremiah Blocker, County Commissioner from St. Johns County. And before the break, we were talking about our speaking schedules. Now, sounds like you're doing more speeches than me. I've done 165 speeches about the submarine and maybe another 50 or so on the other topics.
Well, I can promise you what you're talking about is probably you're much better liked. And usually what I'm talking about is sometimes telling people why we can't build new parks or new bridges or so unfortunately, a lot of these conversations are trying to improve her quality of life. You get the opportunity to tell some great stories.
Well, thank you. It's oddly, I do get some people come up to me afterwards with different kinds of complaints. Particularly when I talk about civil rights, but other issues as well, or they'll disagree. The other thing is to ask me a question like, is it true that the Germans came ashore and went to the movies here, between patrols, and they're convinced. And when I tell them no, that didn't ever happen, they're always really, really disappointed. But that speech about the submarine really took off. I mean, we've done that 165 times. I never really expected it. We just started getting, a lot of demand. And I think one of the parts of that story that drove it was the story about the one of the guys that dies, a guy named William Glenn Rhodes. As far as we can tell, he was in lifeboat number 2. The Germans come to the land side of the oil tanker and begin to shell it with their deck gun, and chaos breaks out, not surprisingly. This guy gets dumped in the sea. He's burnt badly. They pull him from the ocean. When they say they pull him from the ocean, they indicate that the skin pulls off his arms. And he suffers in Mayport for 2 days before he dies. And no one in his family knows until years later that he had lasted. And I think that story really touched the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they were the ones who funded the plaque that we put in Jacksonville Beach. Now, that's probably another thing we have in common. You have a great interest in veterans as well. Is that true? Tell us about that.
It is. I appreciate you bringing that up. So, I come from a family. Every male in my family, going back generations, has served in the military as a combat veteran. I have 4 brothers who are all combat veterans from Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf War. My dad served during the Vietnam era. He was an infantry officer in the Army.
I really feel for those guys particularly.
Absolutely. That was a tough war.
You look at today, there was a lot of talk about the veterans, but when I was a kid, there was a lot less because of Vietnam. So I really do feel for those guys. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to make that point.
No, Scott, I think that's a great point. I mean, we had a whole generation that did exactly what they were asked to do. They either volunteered or were drafted, and they served, and it wasn't a war they picked or necessarily supported, but they did their job. And it's unfortunate. But it's something that happened. It's a lesson we can learn going forward.
And you were telling me that a particular issue with you is veteran suicide. Is that higher amongst the Vietnam guys, or is it spread out pretty evenly?
It's statistically it's spread out fairly evenly. There are some spikes based on I think there's so much about suicide we don't understand, the health issues. My grandfather, I'll share a personal story. My grandfather, who I did not know, he was actually a World War I veteran. So he had my father late in life, who had me late in life, but he actually killed himself. And my father spent his entire life, I think, trying to understand that and trying to get over the fact that they had a trip planned together. And there's always speculation my grandfather got some bad medical news, and maybe that played into it. But what was obvious from what I understand about my grandfather, he struggled greatly with some things that he experienced and was never really able to probably address. He was a very successful man. He had a 6th-grade education and died a multimillionaire through hard work and all that. But he just was never able to really deal with those issues. And at that time, it was not, the 1960s, early 1960s was not, that was not a time where, men and women gathered together and shared their about their depression. So there probably was not a good outlet for him to really get help.
And that war, is not one that we talk about as much. I mean, the most popular history topics are usually World War II and the Civil War. World War I gets covered a little bit, but more stuff has come out recently, and that was just a brutal war in the trenches. And those guys probably suffered from PTSD or something like it. And I think they called it shell shock in World War I. And it must have been awful. Must have been awful for those guys.
Well, absolutely. When you look at like Tolkien and some of the great writers, C.S. Lewis that served and that when they came back, Tolkien wrote some of his great literature as therapy, because he wanted to deal with the awful experiences that he had and really make sense of it. That was the only way he could make sense of it.
I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting. I know Tolkien. I did not know that he wrote his books as sort of a therapy from World War I. We're past our time. We're going to go listen to a couple songs, and we'll be back with Jeremiah Blocker in a couple minutes. Hi, this is Scott Grant. I'm here with Jeremiah Blocker, and before the break, we were talking about veteran suicide and how tough it was on the guys from World War I in the trenches, and then Vietnam. Do we see that same experience with the guys who were in Afghanistan and Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and those operations?
I think so. And when you look at just the cost of life for those wars, between Iraq and Afghanistan, you're looking probably about 6,000 or 7,000 deaths. That may be on the high end. We've had many more veteran suicides since then. Veteran suicide kills more veterans than combat does anymore. Part of that is, as far as why fewer people die in combat is we have better life-saving measures. You can airlift people out. You have better ways of preserving life on the battlefield. What we're not good at now is how do you preserve that life ongoing? How do you help people deal with those experiences? You really take a whole generation, young men and women that are in their formative years, and you put them in an environment where they're killers. And we want them to be killers, and we need them to be killers. But how do you reintroduce that into society where they're surrounded by a team and an environment that looks after them and cares for them? But then at some point they're discharged and they leave, and they lose that sense of purpose. And getting reintroduced into society with those experiences are challenging.
And so you're saying more veterans kill themselves than die in combat?
100%.
Wow, that I would not have thought that. I know veteran suicide is a serious issue,
Sure.
but the idea that more, of course, in a lot of wars, guys die from disease. The Civil War takes as many guys from disease, if not more, than from bullets. But the idea that suicide that really shakes me. What are you doing to help this?
So one of the things we've done recently is the 5 counties in Northeast Florida. Baker County, Clay County, Duval County, Nassau County, and St. Johns County. What we've done is we've come together to form what's called the FireWatch. And this idea comes from in the military. You're sleeping in the barracks. You select a FireWatch. You usually select 2 people to stand guard. So while you're asleep, they stand guard for a couple hours and make sure there's not a fire in the barracks or you're vulnerable. So the time when you're the most vulnerable and need your sleep and need overwatch, you have someone standing there. So we've created this kind of regional task force, all the county governments. We voted unanimously in all the governments, City of Jacksonville, Clay County, Baker, Nassau, St. Johns. I don't think I've ever seen political bodies of local government vote unanimously for anything, so no one can agree. But really, what we've done is we've set this up so we can get the healthcare professionals in at a local level. We want to start addressing this problem at the local level. Now, we don't have all the answers yet, but we want to create the resources and the programming to do it.
Well, we live in a incredibly politically divisive society, and it is difficult to get anybody to agree on anything. But veterans seem to be one of those issues where people from all walks of life praise the veterans. And I think it's great because we're talking earlier saying you didn't see that as much with Vietnam. Those guys came home and really suffered because they weren't welcomed home and thanked for what they did. Whether you agreed with what they did it, for us, and they did it under orders.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's one of the challenges going forward. Wars are not going away. There'll always be wars and rumors of wars, right? So I think, going forward, we have to be wise the conflicts that we engage in, but also mindful that we have to have a clear mission and purpose, and when we bring these veterans home, we need to make sure that we're not just reintroducing them to society with these problems. And again, suicide affects everyone differently because we're all different, but we need to be better at handling it.
Oh yeah, and and you're right. Wars go on, and you think of all the wars that we fought where we didn't have this kind of support system, and these guys suffered. The World War II guys, as much as they were lauded on their return, we know that many of them had problems later in life. But the idea that suicide kills more veterans, we need to do something about that.
I agree.
And I want to commend you. And I think you work with Rory sometimes as well, right?
I do. And really, this vision for FireWatch really originated with Rory Diamond, the CEO of Canine for Warriors and a Jacksonville City Councilman. So Rory gets all the credit for that. It's his vision. The statistics from the Department of Defense and from the VA are that 22 veterans kill themselves every day. And that's across the wars. That's from Vietnam.
22 veterans kill
22
themselves
veterans
a day.
A day.
We need to do something about that. And we need to do something about Alzheimer's as well. And I'd like to remind people that on the 16th at Hemming Park, the North East Florida Alzheimer's Association is having a 2-mile walk where you can help raise money to end that disease in our lifetime. Unfortunately, Jeremiah, we're out of time. I'll be back next week with Grace De La Rosa. Jeremiah, thanks for being here. You were a great guest.
Thanks for having me, Scott.